Hi everybody, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to do something that kind of revisits something we did a long time ago here on chessvideos.tv. So a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, maybe it's got to be, can't be more than 3 years ago, but certainly a while ago anyway, I did a long series on the Sicilian defense, and I think I jokingly called it the Sicilian defense in 15 minutes, or at least that was the original inspiration. And of course, this went on for something like 10 weeks, or 10 shows anyhow. So someone had asked a long time ago, and I think again recently, and I've also kicked this around, about doing a similar set of videos on the Ruy Lopez. Well, I finally feel ambitious enough to do that. So this is going to be episode 1 on the quick Ruy Lopez, or the Ruy Lopez in 15 minutes. Not really, but at least a quick overview of all of the main lines. So this is going to be more than one video, so don't expect to see everything here. Anyway, the Ruy Lopez, or the Spanish opening, begins with these moves. And it's really the most common of all the e4, e5 openings, and it's, I would say, the richest. I mean, black has a wide variety of things that he can do here. And, well, for quite a long time to come, both sides have reasonable alternatives. So in this position, to start with, the main move is a6, which we'll get to last. There's the Berlin defense. There's the Schliemann. Okay, I've played all of these moves. There's bishop to c5, which I've faced, but I don't think I've played. There's g6. There's knight g to e7, which I faced a few times. Never in tournament, but there's a local expert who likes to trot it out and blitz every once in a while. And I think the nicest thing I could say about it is that it's not as bad as it looks, but it's not great either, but it's interesting. There's knight to d4, which is one of these variations that has kind of a cult following, the bird defense. There's the old-fashioned Steinitz, and okay, and that's all we're going to cover in the course of this program. So no doubt there are other squirrely moves, like I think bishop to b4 has been played, but I can't imagine what the point of this is other than to try to play with your opponent's mind. I've seen a5. That's kind of a funny move with the idea of maybe dropping the knight back to a7 in some cases, or to play maybe a4 and try to prevent white from expanding on the queen side. Anyway, human imagination is limitless, and no doubt one can invent all kinds of bizarre things. I think once, a long time ago, maybe in a Scholastic event, I saw someone play d5 against me, and he didn't last very long. What else could be tried? I don't know. Maybe bishop to e7 could be played here. Anyway, we're going to take a look at moves that have had a reasonable following and are all playable. So I'll begin with the granddaddy of them, perhaps, d6. Although I say perhaps because a6 is sometimes called the Morphy defense, which I certainly don't think that Morphy had any real clue about the Ruy Lopez as it's been interpreted in the 20th and 21st centuries, but still, it's I suppose it speaks well of his instincts that he realized that a6 could be played and was a good choice. But d6 was perhaps the first move to be a little bit popular, thanks to the first official world chess champion, Wilhelm Steinitz. So it's a rather cramped approach, and it immediately defends the e5 pawn. Now the thing to notice is that white is not really threatening the pawn just yet. If it were white to move here, enter a new variation, bishop takes c6, d takes c6, knight takes e5 is very easily dealt with by queen to d4. So this is really of no consequence yet. But anyway, d6 immediately takes care of any possible threats to that pawn. And, it's a useful move that helps to develop. The drawback of this is that by not playing a6 first, you don't have the option of breaking the pin with b5 at some point. That's one. Secondly, this bishop on f8 is trapped behind the lines, although that's not necessarily such a bad thing. I mean, the bishop often ends up on e7 behind a pawn on d6, even in the absolute main lines. And alternatively, sometimes it can go to g6. So really, the main reason why d6 is very unpopular now is that it's a little bit passive. It's more or less a kind of a drawing weapon, and B, again, that black doesn't have the option of playing b5 to break the pin, as he does in the deferred Steinitz, like this. Okay, so back to this. After d6, the best move, I would say, certainly the main move, is d4. Okay, bishop to d7. So white's not threatening to win a pawn because takes, d takes e5, there's bishop takes e4. So knight c3 defends the e4 pawn, and knight f6 in turn redefends it, you might say. Okay, castles. And here black can play e takes d4 as well, but we'll look at lines with e takes d4 in a bit. So bishop to e7. And now a couple of moves are playable for white at this point. So probably the main move nowadays is bishop takes c6. So we'll come back to this. But rook to e1 is also important, and this used to be the main move. Now, here black has to be careful. If he tries to kind of maintain the tension, he actually loses a pawn. So this is an old trap called the Tarrasch trap, because it first occurred in the game Tarrasch against Marco from Dresden in 1892. So after castles, white takes on c6. Okay, black needs to recapture. You'll see that black has a little tactical trick in mind here. And now bishop takes e4. So his idea is that it looks like he regains the pawn, because after knight e4, knight e4, if white takes on e4, he gets oopsed with a back rank mate, rook to d1, and rook takes e1, next move. But there's a neat little trick. White plays knight to d3. Okay, we've got a skewer going, but black still has a little bit of wriggle left in him. So he plays f5, f3, and now bishop to c5 check. So has he gotten out of this? Is he surviving? Nope. Knight takes c5, knight takes c5, bishop to g5, and now the rook is attacked, and bishop to e7 is coming next, forking the rook and the knight. So Marco tried rook to d5, and after bishop e7, rook e8, the last move that white needed to find, and it wasn't so hard, was c4. So this wins at least the exchange here. I guess black can still get out, just losing the exchange by playing rook takes e7, but it's dead lost, so he resigned here. So after rook to e1, black cannot just stay in this, can't maintain the central tension. So the right move here is e takes d4, and now the following is pretty typical. Knight takes d4, castles, bishop takes c6, not the knight. The knight can go to f5 in some cases. So b takes c6. If black were to take with the bishop, then knight takes c6 would be fine. Probably knight to f5 would still be pretty good too. Anyway, b takes c6, queen f3, c5, knight f5, takes, and here black does this remaneuvering plan. So his bishop on e7 looks really kind of bad, but he's going to swing it around to f6. So knight to d7, knight to d5, rook e8, and then here white wants to put his bishop on the a1 h8 diagonal, in part so that way black doesn't do that, because white doesn't really want to trade on f6 or take the bishop on e7 if he doesn't have to. But if he doesn't do it, then black just puts his bishop on f6, and it's pretty decent. So anyway, white plays either b3 or bishop to d2 here, and it's again very solid. I mean, white isn't in any trouble, but black is actually pretty good here. So for this reason, the move rook to e1 has kind of gone out of fashion, and now bishop takes c6 is the main move. So now bishop takes c6, queen d3, defending the e4 pawn, and also threatening to take twice now on e5. So e takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop to d7. Again, the fianchetto. There's really not much for the bishop to do on f4 or g5. So we have these natural developing moves, and now with f4, I think white has a nice little advantage in space, some kingside prospects. The bishop on b2 could end up being very good. So this looks slightly in white's favor. Okay, and I suppose I should mention e takes d4 here. Okay, so e takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop to e7. And again, all right, if we play rook to e1, I believe we're just going to transpose into the old main line. So it might be a little bit more accurate to play bishop takes c6, and in fact even b3 is reasonably popular here. So castles, bishop to b2, rook e8, rook e1. Okay, and this again is a slightly more comfortable position for white, who can try any of many moves here. Bishop takes c6, knight takes c6, even h3 to stop knight g4, e5 kinds of ideas. So I'm not sure if if white has a full-fledged advantage here, but I suspect he probably does. I suspect that this position after, for example, knight c6, b c6, bishop c4, ought to be slightly in his favor. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to say about d6. It's not a bad move, but probably white gains an edge there, and it's certainly not an easy line for black to fight for a win. Okay, next up is, before I get to some of the quirkier lines, I'll go to g6, which in some ways has kind of a Steinitzian feel to it. So again, it's a little bit cramped, a little bit slow playing, but delaying the push of the d pawn, because maybe in some line it could go to d5 in one shot. All right, so here white can play a number of moves. c3 is fine, castles is fine, but the main move is the very direct d4. Okay, e takes d4, bishop to g5, bishop e7, takes, bishop c6, d takes c6, queen takes d4, and actually we looked at this line in a recent viewer questions video. So knight f6, knight c3, bishop to g4, and here white has two main approaches. You can play knight to d2 to avoid the exchange on f3, which is not such a big deal, but it slightly damages his majority. So knight to d2 has been played a few times. c5, queen e3, castles, h3, bishop e6, and white castles back. And maybe white has I don't know if white's better, but certainly has prospects for an edge. I mean, the basic idea, as in the exchange variation, is that white has a clean majority on the king side, while black's majority is slightly crippled by virtue of having a doubled pawn. So it's not possible, at least if we're in a king and pawn ending, a pure king and pawn ending, it isn't possible for black to force a passed pawn on the queen side, while white can force a passed pawn on the king side. Now, of course, that's many, many moves away, but still, I mean, that kind of factor is relevant. It's also relevant for a middle game that white has a center pawn, or you could say a clear center pawn, as opposed to c5, which is kind of an auxiliary center pawn. And anyway, black doesn't have a straight center pawn. So all of this together, I think, is more important than black's bishop versus a knight. So, white maybe is slightly more comfortable here. Similarly, after castle and queen side, takes, castles and queen to e3. The character of the play is a little bit different now, but I still think that white's majority is qualitatively better than black's. It's not a lot, but it's a little. So white I think is for choice, and it's variations like this that really keep g6 from being that popular. So it's not bad, but it seems pretty clear that white has an edge in these positions. Okay, so now let's talk about a couple of the knight moves here: knight to d4 and knight g to e7. So we'll begin with the bird cult here with knight to d4. Now, it would be nice if there were some way for white to just avoid the main lines to get a kind of a nice normal position. I mean, you would think a move like knight to d4, that there should be some kind of routine way for white to get a comfortable game, but it really seems like black can at least dictate the play. So that's the nice thing about this. I mean, it's not like bishop to c4 just gets nowhere after bishop to c5. So knight takes d4. I mean, this is really the only good move. E takes d4. Now, there's a little cheapo that white sometimes goes for here with bishop to c4, but I'm not sure if this is really all that great a move, assuming black doesn't fall for it. So the cheapo is that if black plays bishop to c5, white has this simple trick. Bishop takes f7, and then queen h5, followed by queen takes c5. So that's the cheapo. But I don't think it's that good. I mean, black has a number of good moves here. h5 is actually a really kind of quirky and bizarre move, but it seems to be pretty good. And there's some old famous game. I should have looked it up. I think, what is this? Is this Myatt against Anderson, or Anderson against Max Lang? It's some really famous game that black won in beautiful style. Okay, I think I might be confusing it with some other similar position, because I just looked it up and couldn't find it. I did see, though, that the Grandmaster Evgeny Nair actually has played this h5 move quite a bit. So it does have a pretty high pedigree. Anyway, it looks like a bizarre move, but it's it certainly stops the queen h5 idea, and it also supports later on putting a piece on the g4 square. So it looks goofy, but it's not so bad. Also, the main move, which is knight to f6, seems to be quite reasonable too. Castles, c6, rook e1, d6, c3, knight to g4, h3, knight to e5, and black, I think, is okay here as well. So after knight d4, knight takes d4, e takes d4, white should probably just go for the main line and avoid the little quirky, tricky, trappy things and play simply kingside castles. Now from here, black plays bishop to c5, which is what bishop to c4 instead of castling was designed to prevent. Okay, d3, c6, and here bishop to a4 seems to be the most accurate retreat to try to impede black from playing d5 on account of the pin on the diagonal. So there are all kinds of little sidelines, and I'm just giving an overview here. So two moves that I'll mention. One is d6 and one is knight to e7. Okay, after d6, one move that was played pretty recently in a Grandmaster game was knight to d2. Not the only time it was played, but it was played recently. So this was in a game between Szabo, not Laszlo, who's been dead for a few years, but K. Szabo, I'm not sure what his first name is, and Pop from Szombathely in 2010. Anyway, that game continued knight f6, f4, d5, e5, knight g4, knight f3, a5, threatening to Noah's Ark the bishop, a3, b5, bishop b3, a4, bishop to a2, knight h6, so establishing kind of a light square blockade here. And after king to h1, they just agree to a draw. So it's not that this is a dead draw or anything. It's just, I guess they wanted to take the day off. But this kind of play is actually pretty common, as we'll see. So instead of knight to d2, another move that was played last year by even higher level grandmasters was f4. And a game between Kovacevic and Sokolov went like this: f5, bishop to b3, knight f6, knight to d2, again knight to g4, queen e2, knight e3, rook e1, takes, bishop to b6, takes, and now d4. So if bishop takes d4, rook a to d1 is very strong, maybe even just winning. So d5, okay, that takes care of, blocks the diagonal so we can try to castle. But queen h5 stops it. Since g6, queen e5 check would be very bad for black. So king f8. And now c3 was a good move, protecting the pawn on d4. Black, of course, cannot take the knight because of queen f7 mate. And it seems to me that white's better here, and he did go on to win. But, not right away. But I think white, like I said, has some advantage at this point. Okay, so that was just a very, very cursory look at d6. The main alternative is knight to e7. Now, f4, so we've seen this idea before, and white would like to ram this pawn, at least go to f5, where it's going to lock in the black minor pieces, and maybe go to f6, especially in case black castles. So f5 is pretty common here. Now bishop to b3, again, intended to prevent castling, or at least to inconvenience black before he gets castled. d5, takes, okay, and now if knight takes, then rook e1 check is slightly awkward for black. And on c takes d5, queen h5 check, g6, queen h6, again preventing castling. King f7 attempts to engage in a little castling by hand maneuver. And now knight to d2. So white wants to put this knight on g5 or e5, which would be very nice for him. So black gets to at least evict the white queen here and improve his knight, but still after knight to f3, it does seem to me that white is at least a little bit better here. All right, so this again by no means purports to be a full and airtight repertoire against knight to d4, but I hope it's at least representative and gives you some idea of what to do, and really with either side. Okay, next up, knight g to e7. So this, as I said, is kind of a pet line of a local player. It's a pretty good player. And yeah, I was surprised. I mean, it just looked like something that white should just get an easy advantage with normal moves. But it's not really so easy. I mean, moves like castles or c3, with the idea of d4 really aren't quite so effective. So, for instance, on c3, g6, let's say d4, e takes d4, c takes d4, and now d5. And black is actually doing quite reasonably here. This is actually, again, the position just looks precarious. I mean, the sort of combination, you fianchetto, so it looks like you're playing for dark squares, but then you play d5, so it looks like you're going for the light squares. And, white has more central space, and the black king has to wait a few moves to castle. But despite all of this, it really doesn't seem like white has any advantage here. So, yeah, let me give this an exclam. So I think the only really persuasive move, let's say, for white in this position is knight to c3, which is itself kind of funny. So we meet an unusual move by another unusual move. I mean, in many Ruy Lopez's, white wants to play c3, wants to keep c3 clear for the pawn, so he can support d4 and maintain this center. But here it's more important to just develop very rapidly. And, okay, now black plays g6, which is, again, part and parcel of the idea. He just wants to make sure the knights are covering each other first. Okay, well, now d4, e takes d4, and now knight to d5 with a mate threat. So knight f6 mate is threatened. Okay, bishop to g7, bishop to g5, h6. Yeah, you don't want to castle. That would just lose a piece. I mean, castles, whoops. And then bishop takes c6 simply wins at least a piece, maybe even more than that. So h6, and now bishop to f6 is best. And again, castling would be a blunder because of bishop takes c6. So same problem. So bishop takes f6, knight f6, king f8. And again, this is kind of a funny position. I mean, it just looks like white should be much better here, but it's really not so simple. So for example, knight takes d4. And then black has this funny move, knight f5. So we can play queen takes f6. Maybe something like this is best now. Knight h7 check, rook takes h7, e takes f5, queen f6, takes, d takes c6, fg, castles. And I don't know if white's even better here. I mean, the black king, looks a little bit airy, but there are very few pieces left. If white had a dark squared bishop, okay, that would be one thing. Then there might be some cause for celebration. But the knight, while it looks good on d4, I mean, it's not in any way endangering the black king. And, the black rook from h7 is ready to jump into play on any of the central files. And, once the bishop on c8 moves, the rook will be good on d8 or e8 as well. So it looks to me like white really doesn't have much, if anything, here. So going back, instead of knight takes d4, probably white should just castle. So getting on with this development, king g7, and now knight to d5. So we just go back, d6, takes, knight takes d4. And here I think white does probably have a slight edge, thanks to that very nice knight on d5. So this, I think, offers him some comfort. And he also has the idea of playing knight to b5 here. So there's a little threat with that to the pawn on c7. In some cases, white might play for pushing the f-pawn. So anyway, it's not a big deal, but it's a little deal. Also, of course, well, not of course. Maybe knight takes c6 and queen d4 could be played in some cases, but I'm not sure if that gets anywhere after black just plays f6. Maybe. Anyway, the point is that white does have some initiative here. Black has to be very careful that something bad doesn't happen to him here. All right, so that I think is a good way to handle knight g to e7. Okay, the last move we're going to talk about today is bishop to c5, which has had some pretty high-level outings. I mean, I remember this got played, for instance, in the Kamsky-Topalov candidates match back in whatever it was, 2008 maybe? No, I think early 2009. So they're about to play another candidates match here in 2011 in a couple of weeks, at least as of this recording. Okay, here white has two main moves, although I guess, if I remember right, knight takes e5 can be played too. I'm not sure if this promises very much. It looks like there's some jokey moves here, like knight to d4 and queen to g5, that might actually be interesting, but simply Oh, and I should say bishop takes f2 is also possible, but not very good. I mean, usually this counter sack isn't such a great idea. But just a simple knight takes e5, d4, c6. Yeah, I've seen this before. Bishop to e2, bishop to d6, takes, and black doesn't have any real problems here. So it's playable for white, but it's not really so exciting. So the main moves are castles and c3, and sometimes they can transpose. So let's start with c3. Here, black has two main moves. So there's knight f6, and again, after castles, this can transpose to going out the other way around. Castles first, knight f6, c3. We'll come back to that. First, though, I want to talk about f5 and queen to f6. So queen f6 is a funny-looking move, but not so bad. White should play d4 here. So it looks like black has prevented d4, but hey, white should do it anyway. So d4, e takes d4, e5, queen g6, and now c takes d4. Of course, queen g2 is just, well, it might be playable, but very risky, and in any case, white would get the pawn on g7 in any event, so not really any good reason to do that. So bishop to b4 check, knight c3, and here black can either play knight g to e7 or d5. Often they can just transpose. Whoops, let me see. Yeah, I believe just d5 here, and yeah, we're back to the transposition. Okay, so from here, d5, castles, knight g to e7, and now I think with queen to b3, white obtains an edge. After takes, castles, and bishop to a3, it looks like white's bishop pair is quite good. Bishop to h3 is just a dead end. White can play knight e1 with no problem. So probably, well, and also bishop takes c6 is a threat here. So anyway, I think white is probably a little bit better at this point. Certainly looks more comfortable. Okay, another interesting line is f5, and there are a lot of tricky lines here. I'm going to just try to give you a quick overview of how to play this with white. So d4. Now, one sideline that's maybe not so bad for black is e takes d4. Maybe white's best is e takes f5 after that. I think e5 is more common, although I'm not sure that it's any better, but it's also playable. But anyway, after e takes f5, I think white has maybe a tiny edge. Maybe e5 should be looked at more carefully. Black can grab this pawn if he wants to. I don't know that this is so healthy. I mean, white has a few interesting moves like queen to d5. Like knight c3 and castling. So all of these moves are playable. It's very risky for black. Anyway, this can be investigated further, but it's fairly rare for black to play e takes d4. Okay, f takes e4 is the main move, and again, white has a number of moves here. It can play d takes c5. This is also a pretty important move. E takes f3, queen takes f3, knight f6, and then white either castles or plays bishop to g5. Actually, bishop to c4 looks pretty reasonable too, to interfere with black's intent to castle. So this is not bad either, d takes c5. Knight f to d2 a long time ago was the main move, but this doesn't really seem all that great. So the idea, okay, I mean, it has basically a cheapo behind it, which is that if e takes d4, white has queen to h5 check, and then queen takes c5. But the main move here is bishop to b6, getting out of that little cheapo. And after bishop takes c6, b takes c6, queen h5 check, king f8. Okay, you can't play g6 because queen e5 and then queen h8. So king f8, queen takes e5, and now knight f6, for instance. And black seems to be pretty okay. His king really isn't in any trouble. He'll be able to castle by hand quickly enough. He's got the bishop pair. White's development looks kind of strange. So let's say castles, bishop to a6, for instance, rook e1, bishop to d3. And okay, it's a pretty complicated position, but certainly black seems to be all right. Okay, so knight f to d2 I don't think is really all that exciting. So I would give d takes c5 good marks, and bishop takes c6. This is the other move that I wanted to show. So this I think is all right too. D takes c6, knight e5, bishop to d6, queen h5 check, g6, and now not knight takes g6. So this may be a very tempting looking move, but this is not going to be some crusher as you might hope. Knight f6, queen h4, so now there's no discovery that black has to worry about. And he just plays rook to g8. Okay, knight e5, takes, and now a very nice move for black, queen to d3. And I would say this is the move that really takes all the fun out of knight takes g6. Here, I think white has to fight to equalize, and I'm not even sure that he succeeds, frankly. Now, first things first, taking on f6 would be a disaster. Black plays bishop to g4, threatening mate on e2, and on d1 for that matter. If f3, we take, again threatening mate on e2, queen f2, castle, and now we're threatening mate on d1, and we're threatening rook g to e8, and we're threatening f takes g2, and forget about it. White can just set the board up for the next game here. So e takes f6 is hopelessly bad. h3 is what he needs to play to cover the possibility of bishop to g4. But even so, black's attack is really pretty vicious. So bishop to e6, and now the threat is to play bishop to c4, again going to score a touchdown here on e2, and also preparing castles with queen d1 mate stuff in the offing. So knight to d2 is probably best, blocking the d file and covering c4, but again, black castles queenside, and I'm not sure that white is surviving this with best play. I think if you analyze this for a while, the more you analyze, the worse it's going to appear for white. So don't do this. If you're playing white after, again, let's go back through this variation. So from here, after f5, d4, f takes e4, knight takes e4, or bishop takes e6, sorry, dc, knight e5, bishop d6, check here. Here you play queen to e2. And this is probably good for a little bit of an edge. So the e4 pawn is a little bit vulnerable. It's not terrible. You know, it might drop off at some point, and black will still have some compensation thanks to his bishop pair. But probably white is a little bit happier overall. But it's playable for black. So you know, you can play this and maybe hope your opponents will play knight takes g6. But I think if they go for this, it's a little bit of an uphill climb for black. But playable, as I said. And d takes c5 here also needs to be investigated. Okay, so let's get to the main move here, which is knight f6. So castles, d4, and here black does not take on d4, giving up the center, but plays bishop to b6. So that way, on d takes e5, he just plays knight e4. No big deal. Actually, we can look at this a tiny bit, because it's still an important move. So d takes e5, knight e4, and queen d5 looks like it's a big deal for a moment, but just knight to c5, bishop to g5, knight e7, and black manages to hold all of his guys together. So it's playable for white. It's not a trivial line, but but black has decent resources there. Another idea is to play rook to e1, holding on to the e4 square, well, the e4 pawn. So now d takes e5 as a threat. So here black generally plays d6, and then white's got a whole bunch of possibilities here, h3 being the most common. And then black has a lot of responses, bishop to d7, h6, knight e7 being the three most common. So again, you can kind of look this up on your own. It is all quite interesting, all playable. And here too, instead of h3, white also has a4. This is another important move, and then black chooses between a5 and a6. But this seems to actually be pretty good for white. White scores very well here. All right, so yeah, after rook to d1, well, black can also play e takes d4, but that's also does pretty well for white. Anyway, the main move here is bishop to g5. Now h6, bishop h4, d6, queen d3, queen e7, knight b to d2. I mean, that's the point of queen d3. He wants to play knight b to d2, but he has to keep his center pawns protected. And then here black has an interesting little remaneuvering idea. So he plays knight back to b8, so he can play c6, and then eventually swing the knight to d7. And then here white can retreat either to a4 or c4. And play continues from there. So there is quite a bit of theory on this line in the position starting from bishop to b6. So you do need to do some prep from either side of this. But it is a playable line. Probably white is slightly more comfortable, but it's been seen at the highest level. Okay, and then going back here to 4 castles. Again, this will most likely be a transposition, although there are some alternatives here for black. One is to play knight to d4, inviting a return to the bird defense. So e takes d4 be a bird. If bishop takes d4, maybe white can get a little bit of an edge here. Though actually, yeah, I wasn't even able to prove an edge here for white in this line, despite the extra tempi. Okay, maybe knight c4. This might be white's best to play like this. If instead bishop to g5, then h6 takes d5. This has been seen a number of times. But even though black's bishops are fairly passive, it doesn't really seem that there's any way for white to kind of smash through here, to exert his will on the position and get something tangible. So for instance, he can pile up on this d pawn, but after rook f to d8 he's okay. The point being that on knight takes d6, bishop to g4 kind of ruins white's party. So knight to e3 might be best, just covering the d5 square and also f5. But it looks like it's about equal here. So, is knight takes d4 some kind of magic equalizer? Well, again, not really. Or, well, let's say a magic equalizer or getting a trip to the bird. I think white has something that might be better, and it's kind of fun. b4. So this might be a pretty good gambit. Maybe black shouldn't take it. Maybe he should play bishop to b6, although white has scored pretty well there too. Bishop takes b4 is certainly the principled move. But I like white here. I mean, white at least has a nice initiative. This bishop on the long diagonal is great. And, something like bishop to c5, white can play c3 and force this diagonal open sooner or later, and he'll have his 2 pawns in the center. So I kind of like this. I think this is a very interesting and I think sound approach for white. Okay, so that's knight to d4. Another sideline, but an interesting one, is again queen to f6. And, okay, this time d4, of course, isn't happening. So the main move here actually seems to be the restrained d3. And this is actually not so bad. So one idea, of course, is to play bishop to g5. So black often plays h6 here. And now bishop to e3. And black can choose between swapping and playing something like knight g to e7. But white I think, has prospects for an edge here. Or bishop to b6. And now I think the best move for white is not kind of a usual boring Ruy Lopez move like c3 or knight b to d2 or even knight to c3, but c4. I think this is the best way to play, preventing black from getting d5 in any time in the foreseeable future. Black generally plays knight to d4 here, and now I think after bishop takes d4, let's say bishop takes, knight takes, pawn takes, white has some chances for an edge with either c5 or f4. So I prefer white in both of these cases. Okay, so that's queen f6. So finally, knight f6. And this just takes us back to what we already saw. c3, castles d4, and so on. Okay, so that will conclude our first little look into the Ruy Lopez. So we still have some big moves ahead of us. There's the Schliemann with f5. There's the Berlin with knight to f6. And then there's a6, which has gobs and gobs of theory of its own. We may never get to the end of this, but we'll have some fun trying. All right, so that'll do it. Let me know what you think about this. I mean, some of you will probably be enthused about it. Others of you might dread this. And, for those of you who dread it, or at least are kind of maybe ambivalent, don't worry. I may intersperse some Ruy Lopez shows in here too. So it won't just be the Ruy Lopez for the next, 6 years or whatever. But we'll have quite a few anyway ahead of us. All right. Well, anyway, I hope that this will prove helpful to you and a useful overview of theory. So I will see you later, and thanks a lot. Bye-bye.